it is true that we have always had this kind of ethos that, except in very rare cases, usually when elites take action that prejudices or harms other elites, people like Bernie Madoff, who actually stole from a lot of rich people, there is a tendency not to bring criminal charges against them, except this has now been completely abandoned, but not as a general proposition, but only with regard to Donald Trump. He spent 77 years involved in all sorts of transactions that left a lot of people angry, was suited up, was never charged with a crime, and I guess you're now supposed to believe that at the age of 76, he has turned into a chronic criminal. It's a gigantic coincidence that he amassed a huge amount of political power and exercised it in a way that angered every sector of institutional authority in the United States, every sector of American power. The U.S. security state turned against him from the start. The corporate media was united against him. Almost every politician in establishment Republican politics, either publicly or secretly, despised him. I guess you're supposed to believe, if you want to view these prosecutions as valid, that all of that is a gigantic coincidence, that Donald Trump simply broke the law repeatedly, violated the law, the criminal law, committed major crimes in a way that requires, in each of these cases, the law to be pioneered, for new sorts of legal theories to be embraced about what is a crime and what isn't, and that none of it has anything to do with political motivation, with residual anger over the way Trump exercised political power, and especially with fear that Donald Trump is leading most public opinion polls, not just within the Republican primary, but also in a head-to-head matchup with Joe Biden to regain the presidency in 2024, something that leaves most establishment centers of power in the United States aghast. Now, we have, each time President Trump was previously indicted, spent the show dissecting the indictment, dissecting and analyzing the legal issues raised by them. It's not entirely necessary to do so with this latest indictment yesterday from the grand jury in Georgia at the hands of this Fulton County District Attorney, because it's extremely similar in its factual framework to the indictment on a federal level that was brought by Jack Smith just a week ago. Jack Smith's indictment, the second one, the first one was about Donald Trump's alleged carelessness with classified documents in Mar-a-Lago, which, as of course you know, if anyone is careless with classified documents in our media and political elite, they're instantly charged with crimes. Of course, that's exactly untrue. They leak classified information every single day. No one cares. Everyone knows that's part of the game. Trump's not even accused of having done that, and yet he's facing major felony counts, which for me, that combined with the absolute joke of a prosecution brought by the very liberal Democratic District Attorney Alvin Bragg in Manhattan, which was the first one, reveals the sham that's going on here, how transparently the law is being politicized and abused. The third indictment, the first federal one, which was the second federal one, which was brought by Jack Smith, alleged that Trump's efforts to contest and then invalidate the certified results of the 2020 election that certified Joe Biden as the winner and Donald Trump as the loser was criminal in nature. And that's exactly what this new indictment in Georgia alleges. It's based on almost the same facts. The district attorney interviewed almost exactly the same witnesses as Jack Smith interviewed. It's based on essentially the same set of events as that federal indictment. In fact, there's supposed to be prohibitions on things like double jeopardy and being accused of crimes twice for the same set of events. And yet here we have this district attorney in Georgia who has now succeeded in convincing a grand jury, which of course is very easy to do, to return indictments against Trump and 18 of his political allies. And the reason this indictment is more serious in terms of the dangers posed to Trump is because Georgia law has been shaped for many decades by a political so-called tough on crime mentality. And it's one of the reasons why I think people on the right and conservatives who typically cheer for that kind of a ethos need to think twice about whether handing prosecutors this very broad and permissive and sweeping ability to find crimes that take away rights from the defendants, the people accused of committing the crimes, in the name of being tough on crime, whether that has the potential to criminalize all sorts of behaviors and provide huge amounts of discretion in the hands of whoever becomes prosecutors to turn almost anybody into a criminal or a felon for actions that really should not be criminalized. We are going to spend a little bit of time just going over the key details of this indictment on the way to putting it into its key context. So first of all, here from the Associated Press, yesterday is Trump and his 18 allies charged in Georgia election meddling as the former president faces his fourth criminal case. Quote, Donald Trump and 18 allies were indicted in Georgia on Monday over their efforts to overturn his 2020 election loss in the state, with prosecutors using a statute normally associated with mobsters to accuse the former president, lawyers, and other aides of a, quote, criminal enterprise to keep him in power. The nearly 100-page indictment details dozens of acts by Trump or his allies to undo his defeat, including beseeching Georgia's Republican Secretary of State to find enough votes for him to win the battleground state, harassing an election worker who faced false claims of fraud, and attempting to persuade Georgia lawmakers to ignore the will of voters and appoint a new slate of electoral college electors favorable to Trump. Now, that kind of blurs the line between the prosecutor's description of events and the media's accounting for them, although, of course, when it comes to corporate media, there won't really be any line. They're 100% on the side of these prosecutors. I mean, almost every one of these indictments, they barely disguise or attempt to disguise their glee over these indictments being brought. But the whole criminal case, like the one brought by Jack Smith, is contingent upon the belief that when Trump claimed the 2020 election was the byproduct of fraud, he A, was lying. There was no outcome determinative fraud. B, he knew he was lying. In other words, he wasn't pursuing claims that he thought were valid or had any good faith to them. And that C, the methods he used were unlawful to overturn the election. So, for example, in that call to the Georgia official, you can look at these words of, I just want to find 12,000 votes or 11,800 votes. And if you believe that Trump's claims of election fraud were totally false and that he knew they were false, then you can look at that conversation with one interpretation, which is Trump was trying to coerce or encourage politically favorable officials in the state to fabricate or find fake votes in order to give him an election that he knew he had in fact lost. If, however, Donald Trump genuinely believed that there was massive voter fraud and that he had legal opportunities or legal outlets, valid legal outlets to contest them, meaning he thought there were 100,000 fraudulent votes cast or votes for him that weren't counted, and he calls a Georgia official and says, I just need 12,000, it has a much different read. It means that he's essentially calling this Georgia official and saying, I need your help in proving what happened, namely that there was massive fraud and that I was the real winner of Georgia and not Joe Biden. And so I hear so often now liberal left commentators, and it's increasingly this faction, liberal left, is increasingly becoming merged. I know a lot of people who are on like the mainstream Bernie AOC left who pledge their loyalty to the Democratic Party, get so offended when you say liberal left, because I'm not like resistance liberals, we're radicals, we hate the Democratic Party, but increasingly they view every event, every political controversy exactly the same. Their views, their opinions, the content they produce, if they're podcast host or YouTube host or whatever, is completely indistinguishable from the narrative of MSNBC and CNN and the Democratic Party narrative. And I hear some of these people so often saying that these indictments can't possibly be based on Trump's free speech rights because Jack Smith in the second paragraph of the indictment, and this prosecutor too, specifically said it wasn't about that. The level of blind reverence and faith in prosecutors from left liberals is alarming to see. To say that it's out of character and that they're making massive exceptions to what they claim is their worldview. Remember, these are the people marching in 2020 based on the view that all cops are bastards, that the jail should be defunded, defund prisons and the like, that prosecutors are corrupt arms of the evil prison state, they now are willing to say, well, if the prosecutors say this case isn't about free speech, that's proof that it isn't. And anyone who says it just must not have read the indictments, because if a prosecutor says something, then of course that means it's true. You accept it as gospel. Just like they have the same mentality now for corporate media, for the US security state. They really have come to be a political movement that reveres institutions of power because they regard them validly as being their political allies. But if you're willing to look past prosecutorial claims about their own indictment and their own charges, of course prosecutors are going to say, these charges don't infringe free speech rights. Do you think there's ever a prosecutor anywhere who has said, yes, this indictment is about protected free speech? Of course they all say that it's not. You have to actually look past that claim and see whether it's valid. And if you look at these events in this indictment, just like in Jack Smith's indictment, the question of whether Trump really believed that there was election fraud, and whether he really believed because his lawyers told him that these were valid means of contesting election, are critical, because it changes the interpretation of everything. If Trump genuinely believed there was voting fraud, and I know for sure a lot of his followers do, and I believe Trump did as well, despite having been told by some people that there was not enough voting fraud, including Bill Barr, he was told by a lot of other people that he trusted more that there was. And yes, state of mind is crucial for a crime. It is in every single case. If you take a car and run somebody over because you hate that person and want to kill them, that is a completely different act under the criminal law than if you take that car and are drinking and run into somebody by accident whom you don't know and have no intention to kill, even though it looks exactly like the same act, when the only difference is what's going on in your mind. And then if you can prove that you took that car and ran that person over because you actually heard voices in your head as a result of a mental illness, that someone in your head told you to run that person over, or you hallucinated that they were coming to kill you and you could prove that, you won't be guilty of any crime at all because you lack the requisite criminal intent. Intent is everything in the criminal law. And it's so much reminds me of everything that Russiagate was based on, where Trump stood up in a press conference and said, Russia, if you're listening, maybe you can get Hillary Clinton's emails. He was mocking the media so blatantly and flagrantly, using that kind of satirical tone that he always uses, because they were asking him about whether he had worked with the Russians to hack into the DNC's emails. He thought it was preposterous. And so he said, Russia, if you're listening, maybe you can find those missing Hillary Clinton emails. And they decided to interpret that earnestly as some sort of direct request to the Russians to actually hack Hillary Clinton's emails, as though he would make a request to Russia in front of 100 cameras to undertake an illegal act. They're constantly taking Trump's statements and giving them the worst possible interpretation, often absurdly, obscenely dumb, in order to give it the most nefarious possible reading. And so an example like that, where Trump picks up the phone and he either coerces a Georgia official to fabricate 12,000 fraudulent votes, or he picks up the phone and encourages the Georgia official to find what he believes is there, which is voting fraud, makes all the difference in the world for how you interpret this. One of the things I'm increasingly seeing is that when Trump was first indicted, almost every Republican was extremely careful not to defend the prosecutor, including Governor DeSantis, Trump's main opposition. Usually in an election, if your main opponent is indicted, of course you jump on that. You're excited by that. But DeSantis has been very careful, as has almost every other Republican candidate, except the ones who have no chance, who are just there to bash Trump and get on TV for it, like Chris Christie and Asa Hutchinson. But the ones who actually believe they're real candidates to have a chance have been very careful to defend Trump and criticize these prosecutors. Obviously, that was easy to do in the Alvin Bragg prosecution because it's so blatantly frivolous, that case. As you might recall, it just alleges that there was like a bookkeeping inaccuracy designed to mischaracterize the nature of the payments to Stormy Daniels as instead a legal fee, and they took a completely unprecedented legal theory to try and turn that into a felony. Something like that would always be a misdemeanor because Alvin Bragg wanted attention and wanted political approval and wanted to be able to, for ideological reasons, turn Donald Trump into a criminal by dragging him in before a Manhattan jury, knowing they will be politically motivated against him. What I'm now seeing, though, is not so much Ron DeSantis or other candidates coming out and defending these prosecutors because they know Republican voters don't want to hear that, but there are a lot of people, surrogates and the like, people online with a lot of influence who support DeSantis, who are increasingly getting very vocal about starting to defend these prosecutors, including this district attorney in Fulton County, despite her self-identified status as a liberal Democrat. I think it's out of desperation because the more Trump gets indicted, the more his lead grows. And that is absolutely the dynamic that's happening. Still time left, still 6 months to go before the first votes in Iowa are counted. But obviously, if you're DeSantis, you're Nikki Haley, you're Tim Scott, you're any other candidate, you're looking at this with increasing desperation. And so taking the side of the Democrats and liberals and the media in these prosecutions is, for a lot of them, I think, they think it's their only choice. And one of the things they're doing is even now going to defend Stacey Abrams and other Democrats who have also contested elections and tried to overturn elections by saying the difference here is that Stacey Abrams, even though she refused to concede, even though she claims to this very day she really won, was the rightful winner of that 2018 governor's race in Georgia against Brian Kemp, where she was declared the loser. Even though she contested the results and even sought to overturn it through legal theories, they will say she never used any means illegal to try and overturn the election. But that leaves me asking, what is it that Donald Trump did exactly that was illegal? He definitely sued in court multiple times and lost, which is absolutely his right to do. He told Mike Pence what he heard from his lawyers was Mike Pence's ability to do, even if it wasn't, which is act as that vice presidential role and reject as certified results, ones that he regarded had evidence of fraud, and send them back to the states. He arranged for an alternative state of electors to be ready to be anointed in the event he could prove that there was fraud. Well, what about this is criminal? Which of these steps are illegal? You really have to stretch the law to make it into a crime. I'm not saying it's impossible, but this is what I've been saying from the beginning. If we're going to abandon decades worth of consensus among Washington elites and the political and media class, consensus that I have not shared, that I have rejected, but I only want it abandoned if it's going to be applied legally to equally to everybody. I don't want it to be a one-time only exemption for Trump. I had been arguing since the beginning of writing about politics that the media's fraudulent neutrality or posture of not having opinions or not being subjective was devastating to journalism because everybody knows it's a fraud. And then, of course, sometimes as a journalist, you have to take sides if one side is saying something untrue and the other side is saying something true. The example I always use was the use of torture methods by George Bush and Dick Cheney that had been regarded as torture in every single jurisdiction, including American jurisdictions, for decades. And I don't just mean waterboarding. The torture that was used by the United States as part of the war on terror went way beyond that. All kinds of stress positions, keeping people in cold, depriving them of sleep for days at a time to disorient them. Classic techniques of torture that had been regarded as torture and prosecuted as torture by the American authorities for decades. And then simply because George Bush found a couple of lawyers, neocon lawyers in the Justice Department to say it wasn't torture, the media refused to call it torture on the grounds that they shouldn't take sides. And they would start to call it harsh interrogation techniques because that was the terminology the Bush Justice Department had adopted. And I always was against that. Of course, the media needs to have an allegiance to the truth, and sometimes that does mean you say that one side is wrong and the other side is right. They obviously have abandoned this feigned neutrality. They don't pretend at all to be neutral. It's just their loyalty is not to the truth. It's just to defeating Donald Trump. It's not that they've abandoned this practice of feigning neutrality or being objective to a flaw. It's a one-time only exemption for Donald Trump. Everything has been transformed as a result of Donald Trump. Every profession, every institution that has anything to do with politics has abdicated their role in order to do that. And that's the same here. This does not mean, none of these indictments mean that we're now going to start to have a very wide and permissive interpretation of law to start indicting top-level politicians. If it were, I would look at it differently. I would still only favor prosecution where someone has actually committed clear crimes. You cannot go around charging popular politicians with crimes absent clear criminality, because if you do that, you're going to destroy the credibility of the justice system and of the legal authorities who administer it, which is exactly what's happening now. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.